The emergency radio crackled with static at 3:47 a.m., cutting through the howling wind that rattled every window of the National Weather Service station like an angry ghost demanding entry. Dr. Elena Vasquez pressed her palm against the cold glass, watching the anemometer outside spin so violently it had become a blur of metal and fury. The numbers on her screen glowed an impossible red. Sustained winds at 185 miles per hour, gusts reaching 220. Category 5. The kind of hurricane that rewrote maps and left scars on the earth that lasted decades. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Elena, you need to hear this. Marcus Chen, the night shift coordinator, held up the radio with trembling fingers. His usually steady voice carried a tremor that made Elena's stomach clench. In 12 years of working alongside him, she'd never seen Marcus afraid of weather. Fascinated, yes. Respectful, always, but never afraid. The voice on the radio was barely audible through the interference, crackling like fire consuming paper. Coast Guard Station, Pelican Point, 47 souls aboard. Communications down. Estimate 2 hours before... The transmission dissolved into white noise. Elena's breath fogged the window as she leaned closer, her reflection ghostly against the storm-torn darkness outside. Pelican Point. She knew that lighthouse station, a remote outpost 37 nautical miles southeast of Key West, where the Coast Guard maintained a search and rescue operation in what locals called the graveyard. It was a stretch of water where the Gulf Stream collided with shallow reefs, creating conditions that could turn deadly without warning. In normal weather, it was a 40-minute helicopter flight. In Hurricane Miranda, it might as well have been on Mars. Did they say 47? Elena's voice was steady, but her hands betrayed her, trembling as she reached for the weather charts spread across her desk. The papers were covered in red ink. Pressure readings, wind vectors, the projected path of destruction that had been consuming her thoughts for 18 straight hours. 47 confirmed. Dr. James Riley emerged from the back office, his gray hair disheveled from another sleepless night. As the station chief, he carried the weight of every forecast, every warning that went out across the Florida Keys. Elena studied the satellite imagery on her screen, the spiral of Hurricane Miranda so perfectly formed it looked like a cosmic drill bit boring through the atmosphere. The eye was tight, compact, surrounded by towering walls of cloud that reached 60,000 feet into the stratosphere. It was a beautiful monster, and it was heading straight for Pelican Point. "The lighthouse has weathered worse storms," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. They all knew the statistics. Pelican Point had been built in 1892, designed to withstand the fury of the sea, but Miranda was something different. The storm had undergone rapid intensification over the past 6 hours, growing from a Category 2 to a Category 5 in a time frame that defied traditional meteorological models. Elena had been tracking similar phenomena for her doctoral thesis, storms that seemed to feed on their own destruction, growing stronger as they consumed the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico. "Has anyone been able to reach them directly?" Elena asked, already knowing the answer from the grim expressions surrounding her. Last contact was at 11:30 p.m. Chief Petty Officer Sarah Martinez reported that they were secure and prepared to ride it out. Since then, nothing. The backup communication tower went down about an hour ago. Elena pulled up the detailed bathymetric charts of the area around Pelican Point. The lighthouse sat on a small coral island barely 8 feet above mean high tide, surrounded by jagged reefs that had claimed dozens of ships over the past century. During a Category 5 hurricane, storm surge could reach 20 feet or more. Even if the lighthouse structure survived the wind, the island itself could be completely submerged. What about the Coast Guard? Surely they're planning a rescue operation. Marcus exchanged a glance with Riley. "All aircraft are grounded. Admiral Richardson made the call 2 hours ago.
Conditions are beyond the operational limits of even their best crews." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Elena had worked with Coast Guard rescue operations before, knew the caliber of their pilots and crew. If they considered conditions too dangerous, then any rescue attempt would be essentially suicidal. She thought about the 47 people on Pelican Point, probably huddled in the lighthouse's reinforced lower levels, listening to the storm tear at their world with increasing fury. "There has to be something," Elena insisted, her voice rising above the wind outside. "Some way to get to them before the eye wall makes landfall." "Elena?" Riley's voice carried the weight of authority and experience. "I know what you're thinking, and I'm telling you to stop. We've lost too many good people to hurricanes over the years. Heroes who thought they could beat the storm." Elena's laptop chimed with an updated forecast model. The numbers that appeared made her blood run cold. Miranda's central pressure had dropped to 895 millibars, among the lowest ever recorded in the Atlantic. The storm was still intensifying, still growing stronger as it approached the Florida Keys. At this rate, the lighthouse would face winds exceeding 200 miles per hour, with storm surge that could completely overwhelm the small island. She thought about her sister Maria, who had died in Hurricane Andrew 31 years ago. Elena had been only 8 then, too young to understand the meteorology, but old enough to remember the sound of the wind, the way it seemed to have its own malevolent intelligence. Maria had been a paramedic, 23 years old, killed when her ambulance was struck by flying debris while she was attempting to reach an elderly couple trapped in their mobile home. Elena still kept Maria's paramedic badge in her desk drawer, a talisman that reminded her why she had dedicated her life to understanding storms, to giving people the warning time that might save their lives. "There's a window," Elena said suddenly, studying the satellite loop. "Look at this." She projected the satellite imagery onto the large screen that dominated one wall of the weather station. The hurricane's eye was clearly visible, a perfect circle of relative calm surrounded by towering walls of destruction. "The eye is going to pass within 15 miles of Pelican Point around 6 a.m. For maybe 20 minutes, conditions might be flyable." "Absolutely not," Riley said firmly. "Even in the eye, there are downdrafts, wind shear, debris, and that's assuming a pilot could survive flying through the eye wall to get there." "A pilot couldn't," Elena agreed, "but someone with intimate knowledge of hurricane structure might have a chance. Someone who spent the last 15 years studying eye wall dynamics and mesocyclonic rotation patterns." The room fell silent except for the continuous roar of wind outside. Marcus was the first to speak. "Elena, you're a meteorologist, not a pilot." "I have my commercial license, multi-engine, instrument-rated. I've logged over 400 hours in turbulent conditions, including storm penetration flights for research." It was true, though she hadn't flown in nearly 2 years. After the budget cuts that eliminated the Hurricane Hunter program, Elena had focused entirely on computer modeling and satellite analysis. But she still maintained her license, still felt the pull of the sky, the desire to meet storms on their own terms, rather than simply observe them from a distance. "This is insane," Riley said, but he could hear the doubt creeping into his voice. They all knew the mathematics of the situation. 47 people were going to die unless someone could reach them before the hurricane made landfall. The Coast Guard was grounded. The Navy was grounded. Every rational rescue operation had been called off.
But Elena wasn't thinking rationally. She was thinking about Maria, about the paramedic badge in her desk drawer, about 47 people who were running out of time. She was thinking about Chief Petty Officer Sarah Martinez, whom she'd met at a conference last year, a woman with 3 children and a husband who taught elementary school. She was thinking about the research team who had been helping with evacuations,
civilians who had volunteered to help others and now found themselves trapped. "The Weather Service has a Cessna 402 at Marathon Airport," Elena said, her voice gaining strength. "Twin engine, designed for atmospheric research. It's been modified with additional weather instruments and reinforced for turbulence. It's also 30 years old and hasn't been properly maintained since the program shut down," Marcus pointed out. Elena was already pulling up the aircraft specifications on her computer. "I inspected it myself 6 months ago for possible sale. The engines were recently overhauled, avionics updated. It's airworthy." "Airworthy for fair weather flying, not penetrating the strongest hurricane ever recorded," Riley said. But he was moving toward his desk, toward the secure phone that connected him to emergency management headquarters. Elena studied the storm's structure one more time, mentally calculating wind speeds, pressure differentials, the precise timing required to reach Pelican Point during the brief window when the eye passed overhead. It would require flying through the eye wall, a ring of the most violent weather on Earth, not once, but twice. The margin for error was essentially zero. "Elena," Marcus said softly, placing a hand on her shoulder, "even if you could somehow reach them, how would you get 47 people off a lighthouse in 20 minutes during a hurricane?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Elena closed her eyes, visualizing the lighthouse structure, the small helipad that had been installed 5 years ago for Coast Guard operations. She thought about payload calculations, aircraft capacity, the impossible mathematics of rescue. "I couldn't take everyone at once, maybe 12 people per trip, 4 trips total. That's over an hour in the eye. The eye's only going to be overhead for 20 minutes maximum." Elena opened her eyes, staring at the satellite image of Hurricane Miranda. The storm's eye was perfectly formed, almost hypnotically beautiful in its symmetry. She had spent her career studying these phenomena, understanding their structure, their behavior, their power, but she had never challenged one directly. "The eye is moving at about 8 miles per hour. If I could somehow influence its forward progress, delay it slightly." Both men stared at her. "Elena," Marcus said carefully, "you can't control a hurricane." "No," Elena agreed, "but I might be able to nudge it. Cloud seeding has been used experimentally to weaken storms. Project Storm Fury in the 1960s showed that silver iodide injection could disrupt the eye wall structure. It didn't work for weakening storms, but it did affect their trajectory and timing." "That research was abandoned decades ago," Riley pointed out, "because it couldn't weaken hurricanes effectively, but it could create temporary disruptions in eye wall convection, enough to expand the eye, slow its forward motion slightly, maybe by an extra 10 or 15 minutes. The radio crackled again, this time with a different voice. "National Weather Service, this is Admiral Richardson, Coast Guard Sector Key West. Are you monitoring the situation at Pelican Point?" "Admiral, this is Dr. Riley at Marathon Station. We're tracking the storm and are aware of the personnel stranded at the lighthouse." "Dr. Riley, I need your honest assessment. What are their chances?" Elena watched Riley's face as he considered the question. The answer was written in the satellite imagery, in the wind measurements, in the inexorable mathematics of storm surge and structural engineering. Without rescue, the 47 people at Pelican Point had perhaps a 10% chance of survival. "Not good, Admiral," Riley said finally. "Miranda is still intensifying. Storm surge will likely overtop the island." "Understood. We're maintaining contact attempts, but..." The Admiral's voice trailed off, and Elena could fill in the unspoken words. They were writing off 47 lives because the risk was too great. Elena found herself standing, moving toward the window again. Outside, palm trees bent nearly horizontal in the wind, their fronds stripped away to leave only bare trunks that swayed like desperate arms. Street signs had become projectiles. A piece of roofing material tumbled past the window like a giant playing card thrown by an invisible hand. "Admiral," Elena said, taking the radio from Riley's surprised grasp, "this is Dr. Elena Vasquez. I'd like to discuss a possible rescue operation." The silence that followed Elena's words seemed to stretch longer than the eye of the hurricane itself. Through the radio static, she could almost feel Admiral Richardson weighing her proposal against 30 years of Coast Guard experience and the ironclad protocols that kept rescue personnel alive. "Dr. Vasquez," Admiral Richardson's voice finally crackled back, "I'm familiar with your work on hurricane dynamics, but I'm not sure what kind of rescue operation a meteorologist could mount that my best pilots cannot." Elena's grip tightened on the radio. She could feel Marcus and Riley watching her, waiting to see if she would retreat into the safety of theoretical discussion or commit to the dangerous path she was suggesting. The truth was, she didn't fully know herself. The idea had emerged from the collision of desperation and expertise, the kind of impossible solution that only made sense when all rational options had been exhausted. "I'm proposing to fly into the eye during the 20-minute window when it passes over Pelican Point. Use cloud seeding techniques to expand the eye slightly, buy additional time for multiple evacuation trips." The radio remained silent for so long that Elena wondered if the transmission had been lost. When Admiral Richardson finally responded, his voice carried the weight of command decisions made in impossible circumstances. "Dr. Vasquez, even assuming such a plan were meteorologically feasible, do you have any idea what you'd be flying into? We're talking about wind speeds that exceed the design parameters of any civilian aircraft, vertical wind shear that can tear planes apart, hail the size of softballs moving at over 100 miles per hour. Elena closed her eyes, visualizing the internal structure of Hurricane Miranda. She had spent countless hours studying the dynamics of eye wall convection, the way air rose in towering columns before cascading downward in violent downdrafts. She knew the physics intimately, had published papers on mesocyclonic rotation and pressure gradient interactions, but knowing the science and experiencing it firsthand were vastly different things. "I understand the risks, Admiral," she replied, "but I also understand the alternative. Without intervention, those 47 people are going to die." "Elena," Riley's voice was gentle but firm, "let me tell you about the last meteorologist who tried to fly into a Category 5 hurricane, Dr. Robert Simpson, one of the pioneers of hurricane research. Even with military-grade aircraft and full support teams, he nearly died when his plane was caught in a downdraft that dropped him 3,000 feet in under 10 seconds. That was in 1965 with Hurricane Betsy. Miranda is stronger." Elena opened her eyes, looking at the framed photograph on the wall that showed her with her research team after successfully completing their last storm penetration flight 2 years ago. It had been a Category 2 hurricane, manageable conditions that allowed them to collect valuable data on storm structure. Hurricane Miranda was an entirely different magnitude of challenge. "Dr. Vasquez," Admiral Richardson continued over the radio, "I appreciate your dedication, but I cannot authorize or support a civilian rescue attempt under these conditions. The liability alone. You're not authorizing it. I'm a private pilot with access to a research aircraft. If I choose to file a flight plan and attempt a rescue, that's my decision." "Elena, no," Marcus stepped forward, his face pale with concern. "Think about what you're saying. You're talking about committing suicide to attempt an impossible rescue."
Elena turned to face her colleagues, these men who had become like family over the years of working together through countless storm seasons. Marcus, with his methodical approach to data analysis and his 3 cats he talked about constantly. Riley, whose gruff exterior hid a deep compassion for the communities they protected with their forecasts. They were good men, careful scientists who understood the value of measured risk and rational decision-making. But Elena had grown up in the shadow of Hurricane Andrew. She had been shaped by the memory of her sister Maria, who had driven into a storm to save strangers and paid for that courage with her life. Elena had spent her career studying hurricanes, understanding them, respecting their power. But she had never truly challenged one. "Can I tell you about Chief Petty Officer Sarah Martinez?" Elena asked quietly, moving away from the radio so her words wouldn't be transmitted. "She has 3 kids, Emma, age 7, Carlos, age 10,
and Sophia, who just started high school. She showed me pictures at the Hurricane Preparedness Conference last year. Sophia wants to be a veterinarian. Emma collects seashells and knows the names of every fish in the Keys. Elena's voice grew stronger as she continued. Dr. Patricia Wang is one of the researchers trapped there. She's been studying coral reef recovery for 15 years, working to understand how marine ecosystems adapt to warming oceans. Last month, she discovered a new species of coral that might be more resilient to temperature change. That research could help save reef systems worldwide. She paused, looking out the window at the storm's fury. And there's Tom Bradley, the lighthouse keeper. He's 73 years old, been maintaining that station for over 40 years. He knows every sound the lighthouse makes, every stress point in the structure. If anyone can keep those people safe through the storm, it's Tom. But even he can't hold back the ocean. Marcus shook his head. Elena, I understand the human cost. We all do. But throwing your life away in a futile gesture won't save them. It will just add your name to the list of casualties. Is it futile? Elena asked, returning to her computer and pulling up the detailed storm analysis. Look at these wind shear patterns in the eye wall. There are actually calm corridors, brief channels of reduced turbulence that occur during eye wall replacement cycles. If I timed the approach correctly, use the aircraft's weather radar to navigate these corridors. She traced her finger along the screen, showing the complex three-dimensional structure of the hurricane. Miranda is undergoing eye wall replacement right now. The inner eye wall is contracting, while an outer eye wall forms. For about 30 minutes during this process, there are windows of reduced intensity. Riley studied the data over her shoulder. Elena, if you're right about the eye wall replacement cycle, the timing would have to be perfect. A few minutes too early or too late, and you'd be flying into 200-mile-per-hour winds. I know, Elena said simply. That's why it has to be me. I understand this storm better than anyone. I've been tracking it since it was just a tropical depression off the coast of Africa. I know its behavior patterns, its tendency to wobble north-northeast before making landfall. I know that the eye wall replacement cycle occurs every 6 to 8 hours during periods of rapid intensification. The radio crackled again. National Weather Service, this is Martinez at Pelican Point. Can anyone hear me? Elena's heart leapt. She grabbed the radio from Riley before he could object. Chief Martinez, this is Dr. Elena Vasquez at Marathon Weather Station. We hear you. What's your status? The response was broken by static, but Elena could make out fragments. Lighthouse holding, water rising, several injured, not sure how long. Chief Martinez, what is your current situation? How many people do you have with you? 47 total, including research team. Lighthouse structure sound, but storm surge increasing. Maybe 2 hours before.
The transmission cut to static again. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. 2 hours. If Chief Martinez's estimate was correct, Pelican Point would be overrun by storm surge well before Hurricane Miranda's eye passed overhead. Her theoretical rescue window was closing even as she watched. Elena, Riley said gently, you heard her. They might not even survive until the eye arrives. This plan could still work, Elena finished firmly. The lighthouse is built on a coral reef platform that extends below sea level. Even if the island is temporarily submerged, the lighthouse structure rises 90 feet above mean high tide. The lower levels will flood, but the upper levels should remain dry. Elena's mind raced through the logistics. The lighthouse had been designed to withstand Category 4 hurricanes, with walls 3 feet thick at the base and a reinforced spiral staircase leading to the lamp room. The upper levels included storage areas and the lighthouse keeper's quarters, enough space to shelter 47 people if they could reach it before the storm surge peaked. Martinez? Elena called into the radio, hoping the transmission would get through. Chief Martinez, can you move everyone to the upper levels of the lighthouse, above the 70-foot mark? Static answered her, but after a moment, a different voice came through. This is Tom Bradley, lighthouse keeper. We're already moving people up.
Structure sound, but we're taking on water fast. Storm surge is coming in waves, each one higher than the last. Elena closed her eyes, visualizing the scene. Tom Bradley, a man who had weathered dozens of storms, coordinating the movement of 47 people up the narrow spiral staircase of the lighthouse while Hurricane Miranda tore at the world outside. The courage required just to stay calm in such circumstances was almost incomprehensible. Tom, this is Elena Vasquez. I'm going to attempt a rescue operation during the eye passage. Can you prepare a landing zone on the upper platform? Dr. Vasquez. Tom's voice was thick with emotion. I know that voice. You're Maria's little sister, aren't you? I remember her from when she was stationed here, back in '93. The words hit Elena like a physical blow. She had forgotten that Tom Bradley had known Maria, had worked with her during the brief period when her sister was assigned to Coast Guard operations in the Keys. Maria had mentioned the lighthouse keeper in her letters, describing him as a man who could read the ocean like others read books. Yes, Elena said softly, I'm Maria's sister. She was brave as hell, Tom said, and he could hear the wind howling in the background of his transmission. Used to fly rescue missions and weather that would ground anyone else. Saved a lot of lives. You sound just like her. Elena felt tears starting in her eyes. She had spent 31 years trying to honor Maria's memory through her work in meteorology, through forecasts that saved lives and research that improved hurricane prediction. But she had never truly understood the courage her sister had shown, the willingness to risk everything for people she had never met. Tom, Elena said, her voice steady despite the emotions churning inside her, can you clear a landing zone? There's a helipad on the service platform, about 80 feet up. If the helicopter can handle the winds in the eye, I can get people ready for evacuation. Elena looked at Marcus and Riley, seeing her own determination reflected in their worried faces. These men had become her family over the years, had supported her through the challenging early years of her career, when being a woman in meteorology meant constantly proving herself. They understood her in ways that went beyond their shared love of weather science. The Cessna isn't a helicopter, Elena explained. I'll need to drop emergency supplies and equipment by parachute, then land at Marathon Airport to refuel between evacuation flights. Each trip will take about 40 minutes round trip, assuming I can navigate the eye wall successfully.
Elena, Marcus said quietly, even if everything goes perfectly, you'd need at least 4 flights to evacuate everyone. That's nearly 3 hours in and around the most dangerous storm ever recorded. The odds of surviving even one flight are— I know, Elena said. I've run the calculations 100 times, but the odds of doing nothing are worse. Admiral Richardson's voice returned to the radio, cutting through their conversation. Dr. Vasquez, I've been monitoring your transmission. While I cannot officially support your plan, I want you to know that we have Coast Guard vessels standing by at safe distances. If you somehow manage to bring people out, we'll be ready to provide medical support and evacuation to safety. Elena felt a surge of gratitude. The Admiral wasn't endorsing her plan, but he wasn't forbidding it either. In the complex world of emergency response, that qualified as tacit support. Thank you, Admiral. I'll file a flight plan for departure at 0530 hours. Elena, wait. Riley grabbed her arm as she started to move toward the door. If you're really going to do this, you can't go alone. You'll need someone to monitor weather conditions, handle communications, maybe operate emergency equipment. Elena shook her head. I can't ask anyone else to— You're not asking, Marcus interrupted, pulling on his jacket. I'm volunteering. I have my private pilot license, and I know storm meteorology almost as well as you do. 2 pairs of eyes will give you a better chance of navigating the eye wall. Elena stared at her colleague, this gentle man who spent his free time photographing butterflies and volunteering at the local animal shelter. Marcus, this isn't your fight. You don't have to. 47 people, Marcus said simply. Maria would understand. Elena felt the last of her doubts dissolve. Standing in the weather station as Hurricane Miranda raged outside, surrounded by the tools and technology she had devoted her life to mastering, she finally understood what her sister had felt 31 years ago. The mathematics of risk and reward became irrelevant when weighed against the simple fact that people were going to die without help. "All right," Elena said, her voice carrying a calm certainty that surprised her. "Let's go save some lives." The Marathon airport sat under siege, its hangars groaning like wounded animals as Hurricane Miranda's outer bands lashed the Florida Keys with increasing fury. Elena and Marcus arrived at 4:15 a.m. to find the facility officially closed, its runways swept by debris and standing water. The only aircraft visible through the chain-link fence was the Weather Service's Cessna 402, tied down with cables that vibrated like guitar strings in the relentless wind. "Jesus Christ, Elena! You can't be serious about flying in this." Joe Kellerman, the airport manager, had met them at the gate despite the early hour and dangerous conditions. His weathered face, normally cheerful beneath a Miami Dolphins cap, showed the strain of a man who had watched too many storms over the years. "I've seen Category 5s before. This isn't weather. It's the wrath of God." Elena studied the Cessna through the driving rain that hammered against the terminal windows. The aircraft looked impossibly fragile against the backdrop of the storm, its white fuselage streaked with water and debris. But she knew the plane's specifications by heart. Twin Continental engines rated for 325 horsepower each, reinforced wings designed to handle atmospheric turbulence, weather radar capable of penetrating storm systems up to 300 nautical miles away. "Joe, I need you to help me pre-flight the aircraft," Elena said, pulling on the heavy rain gear she'd brought from the weather station. "Full fuel load, emergency supplies, survival equipment." "Elena, I can't let you do this." Joe's voice carried the authority of someone who had spent 40 years keeping pilots alive through good decisions and firm boundaries. "The insurance alone would bankrupt the Weather Service if something happens. And something will happen. No aircraft can survive what's out there." Marcus was studying the latest weather radar on his tablet, tracking the storm's movement with the focused intensity Elena knew so well. "The eye is still on course to pass within 12 miles of Pelican Point at 0630 hours. Eye wall replacement cycle appears to be completing. We might actually have a window."
Elena felt the familiar surge of clarity that came when theoretical meteorology met practical application. She had spent 15 years studying hurricane dynamics from the safety of weather stations and research facilities. But hurricanes weren't meant to be observed from a distance. They were vast, dynamic systems that could only be truly understood from within. "Joe," Elena said, her voice taking on the firm tone she used during emergency briefings, "I'm going to file a flight plan for atmospheric research. You can either help me ensure the aircraft is properly prepared, or I can attempt to do it myself in conditions that make a thorough pre-flight inspection nearly impossible." Joe stared at her for a long moment, then cursed creatively in 3 languages. "Maria was just as stubborn," he said finally. "All right, but we do this right. Full emergency protocol. If that plane isn't absolutely perfect, you don't fly." The pre-flight inspection took nearly an hour, conducted in driving rain and wind that made conversation difficult. Elena methodically checked every system, every control surface, every instrument that might mean the difference between life and death. The Cessna 402 had been designed for weather reconnaissance with reinforced airframe components and redundant navigation systems, but it had never been intended for penetrating the eye wall of a Category 5 hurricane. "Oil pressure looks good on both engines," Marcus reported, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Avionics are functioning normally. Weather radar is showing clear definition of storm structure." Elena examined the aircraft's weather modification equipment, silver iodine dispensers that had been installed for cloud seeding research. The system was designed to inject particles into storm clouds to study precipitation processes.
She was hoping it might also be capable of disrupting the eye wall structure enough to expand Hurricane Miranda's eye, buying precious additional minutes for evacuation operations. "Dr. Vasquez," a new voice called out through the storm. Elena turned to see a young Coast Guard officer approaching through the rain, his uniform soaked despite the heavy weather gear. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, Coast Guard Aviation. Admiral Richardson sent me with some equipment that might help." Morrison led them to a Coast Guard vehicle parked near the hangar, its emergency lights casting red and blue strobes through the storm. In the back were several cases of equipment Elena didn't recognize. Sophisticated electronic devices with military markings and cables that suggested they were designed for aircraft installation. "Emergency locator beacons," Morrison explained, opening the first case. "Military grade, designed to function even in extreme electromagnetic conditions. If something happens during your flight, we'll be able to track your position." He paused, studying Elena's face in the flashing lights. "Admiral Richardson also wanted me to tell you that unofficially, the Coast Guard considers this a search and rescue operation. We'll have assets standing by." Elena felt a surge of gratitude mixed with soberness at the implications. The Coast Guard was preparing for her failure, positioning themselves to recover her body and Marcus's when the hurricane inevitably claimed them. But they were also acknowledging that 47 lives hung in the balance, that desperate situations sometimes required desperate measures. "There's something else," Morrison continued, pulling a waterproof bag from the vehicle. "Satellite communication equipment. It'll let you maintain contact with rescue coordination even when you're inside the storm. The Coast Guard pilots insisted on it." Elena accepted the equipment, recognizing the gesture for what it was. The Coast Guard's most experienced hurricane pilots, the men and women who had been grounded by conditions too dangerous for their heavily modified aircraft, were offering her the tools that might make an impossible mission merely suicidal. "Lieutenant Commander," Elena said, "please tell Admiral Richardson that we understand the risks, and thank the pilots for their support." Morrison nodded, then hesitated. "Dr. Vasquez, can I ask you something? What makes you think you can succeed where Coast Guard pilots cannot?" Elena considered the question, looking out at the Cessna 402 being buffeted by wind and rain. "I don't think I'm a better pilot than the Coast Guard," she said honestly. "But I understand this storm in ways that go beyond piloting skills. I've been tracking Miranda since she was born. Know her behavior patterns, her structural dynamics, the way she responds to atmospheric pressure changes. Sometimes knowledge can substitute for experience." "And sometimes it gets you killed," Morrison replied bluntly. But there was respect in his voice, the acknowledgement of one professional for another's expertise. By 5:30 a.m., the Cessna was fully loaded and ready for departure. Elena had filed a flight plan for atmospheric research operations, which was technically accurate, if completely inadequate to describe what they were attempting. The aircraft carried emergency supplies for the Pelican Point survivors, cloud seeding equipment, survival beer, and enough fuel for multiple flights into the most dangerous weather system ever recorded. Elena settled into the pilot's seat, running through the familiar checklist that had preceded hundreds of research flights over the years. But as her hands moved across the controls, checking switches and instruments, she was acutely aware that this flight was different. Every other storm penetration had been conducted with extensive ground support, weather reconnaissance, data, and escape routes planned in advance. Today, she was flying blind into the heart of a monster. "Elena," Marcus said from the co-pilot's seat, his voice barely steady, "I've been thinking about the eye wall penetration. The radar is showing wind speeds over 200 miles per hour in the inner eye wall. Even if we find a corridor of reduced turbulence, the aircraft is going to take a beating." Elena started the engines, feeling the familiar vibration of the Continental power plants coming to life. Despite the storm raging outside, the engines ran smoothly, their gauges showing normal readings. "Marcus, I need you to understand something," she said, adjusting her headset as she prepared for taxi clearance.
Once we enter the eye wall, there's no turning back. The energy required to reverse course in those conditions would tear the aircraft apart. We're committed to the full penetration." Marcus nodded, but Elena could see the fear in his eyes. He was a meteorologist, not a pilot. His understanding of hurricane dynamics was theoretical, based on computer models and satellite imagery. He had never experienced the physical reality of flying through conditions that challenged the fundamental limits of aircraft design. "Tower, this is November 8:42 weather requesting taxi clearance for departure," Elena said into her radio, knowing the tower was officially closed but hoping someone might be monitoring emergency frequencies. "November 8:42 weather, Marathon Tower," came an unexpected reply. "Be advised, field conditions are currently below safe minimums for departure. Winds are gusting to 85 knots with heavy precipitation and debris on runway." Elena checked her instruments. The wind speed indicators showed gusts varying between 70 and 90 knots, well beyond the normal limits for takeoff operations. But the Cessna 402 had been designed for extreme conditions, with reinforced landing gear and control surfaces rated for high wind operations. "Marathon Tower, 8:42 weather is declaring emergency authority under Part 91, Elena replied, using the regulatory language that gave pilots final authority over flight operations during genuine emergencies. "We have lives at stake and are proceeding with takeoff." The tower controller's response carried a mixture of resignation and respect. 8:42 weather, you are cleared for takeoff at your own risk. Wind is 090 at 78 knots, gusting to 92. Altimeter 28.15 and falling. Good luck. Elena advanced the throttles, feeling the aircraft strain against the wheel brakes as the engine spooled up to full power. Through the windscreen, she could see debris swirling across the runway, palm fronds, pieces of roofing material, chunks of concrete torn from building foundations. The Cessna shuddered as crosswinds tried to push it sideways, but the aircraft held course as Elena released the brakes and began the takeoff roll. The acceleration felt sluggish in the dense, moisture-laden air, but both engines were developing full power. Elena held the yoke firmly, fighting to keep the aircraft centered on the runway as crosswinds hammered from the left. At 85 knots, she pulled back gently, feeling the Cessna lift reluctantly into the turbulent air. "Positive rate, gear up," Elena called out, following the familiar pattern of professional crew coordination. But as the landing gear retracted, the aircraft was immediately caught in severe turbulence that threw them violently to the left.
"Jesus!" Marcus shouted, gripping his seat as the aircraft rolled nearly 45 degrees before Elena could counter with opposite aileron. The vertical speed indicator showed they were climbing and descending simultaneously, caught in the chaotic air currents surrounding Hurricane Miranda's outer bands. Elena fought to maintain control, using all her experience from years of storm penetration flights. But this was different, more violent, more unpredictable than any weather she had encountered. The aircraft was being tossed like a toy in the hands of an angry child, its structure groaning under forces that approached the limits of its design. "Weather radar contact," Marcus reported, his voice tight with concentration as he studied the storm structure on their instruments. "We're looking at the outer eye wall, approximately 40 miles ahead. Wind speeds are showing 195 to 205 miles per hour. Elena adjusted course slightly, aiming for what appeared to be a gap in the most intense convection. The weather radar painted the hurricane in ominous shades of red and purple, with the eye visible as a dark circle surrounded by towering walls of precipitation and wind. It looked like a vast tunnel boring through the atmosphere, beautiful and terrifying in its perfect symmetry. "Elena," Marcus said, his voice barely audible over the engine noise and wind buffeting the aircraft, "I'm showing rapid pressure drops ahead. The eye wall replacement cycle is completing faster than predicted." Elena checked her instruments, seeing the same data that was causing Marcus concern. Hurricane Miranda was still intensifying, even as it approached landfall. The central pressure had dropped to 891 millibars, a reading so low it challenged the limits of their instruments. They were flying toward the strongest hurricane ever recorded in the Atlantic Basin. At 15 miles from the eye wall, the turbulence became so severe that Elena could barely read her instruments. The aircraft was climbing and descending 500 feet per minute without any input from the controls, caught in updrafts and downdrafts that defied prediction.
She reduced power slightly, trying to maintain structural integrity as Hurricane Miranda began to demonstrate why every other pilot had been grounded. "Contact from Pelican Point," Marcus reported, adjusting the radio to cut through the static. "Tom Bradley is reporting water level at 43 feet and rising. They've moved everyone to the lamp room." Elena felt her heart sink. The lamp room was the highest accessible area of the lighthouse, nearly 90 feet above mean sea level. If storm surge was already reaching 43 feet, the island itself was completely submerged. The 47 people on Pelican Point were trapped in the top of a lighthouse, surrounded by an ocean that was trying to claim them. "Tom, this is Elena," she called into the radio. "What's your current situation?" "Dr. Vasquez." Tom's voice was strained but steady. "We're secure for now, but the water's still rising. Waves are breaking over the service platform. I don't know how much longer the structure can take this beating." Elena could hear the wind in the background of Tom's transmission, a constant roar that spoke of forces beyond human comprehension. She tried to imagine 47 people crowded into the lighthouse's lamp room, listening to the storm tear at their refuge, while the ocean rose around them like a slowly closing fist. "Tom, we're 10 minutes out from eye wall penetration. Hold on." At 8 miles from the eye wall, the Cessna entered conditions that redefined Elena's understanding of severe weather. The aircraft was being thrown through the sky with such violence that maintaining consciousness required conscious effort. The altimeter spun wildly as they were caught in vertical air currents exceeding 3,000 feet per minute. Elena's vision grayed at the edges as G-forces pressed her deep into her seat. "Can't read instruments," Marcus gasped, his voice strained by the forces trying to tear them apart. "Everything's moving too fast." Elena forced herself to focus on the primary flight instruments, using her peripheral vision to track artificial horizon and airspeed. The weather radar ahead showed the eye wall as almost a solid wall of precipitation and wind, a barrier that seemed impenetrable. But she could also see the gaps, brief corridors where the convection was slightly less intense, channels that might allow passage for an aircraft crazy enough to attempt it.
"There," Elena shouted over the noise, pointing at a narrow band of reduced intensity on the radar display. "Entry corridor at 2 o'clock, about 15 degrees off our current heading." She banked the aircraft right, immediately feeling the increased resistance as they angled toward the eye wall's most intense region. The turbulence became so severe that the control yoke was torn from her hands twice, the aircraft's own stability systems fighting to maintain controlled flight in conditions no civilian aircraft was designed to handle. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. At 3 miles from eye wall penetration, Elena made a decision that would either save 47 lives or add 2 more names to Hurricane Miranda's casualty list. She advanced the throttles to maximum power and pointed the Cessna's nose directly at the gap in the eye wall she had identified on radar. "Marcus," she called out, "activate the cloud seeding equipment. We're going to try to disrupt the eye wall structure as we penetrate." Marcus's hands moved across the control panel, activating the silver iodide dispensers that would inject thousands of particles into the hurricane's convection system. It was a desperate gambit based on decades-old research, but it might be their only chance to expand the eye enough for multiple evacuation flights. The entry into Hurricane Miranda's eye wall was like flying into the mouth of hell. Wind speeds that had been merely dangerous became literally incomprehensible, with gusts exceeding 220 miles per hour that turned the Cessna into a projectile being fired through a tunnel of violence. The aircraft rolled completely inverted twice, and Elena found herself flying upside down while fighting to regain control with instruments that were spinning too fast to read. "Altitude!" Marcus screamed, pointing at the altimeter that showed they were descending at over 4,000 feet per minute in a downdraft that seemed determined to drive them into the ocean. Elena pulled back hard on the yoke, feeling the aircraft's structure groan under the stress of fighting hurricane-force vertical winds. For a terrifying moment, the controls felt disconnected, as if the flight surfaces had been torn away by the storm. Then, gradually, the Cessna began to respond, clawing its way back to level flight through sheer mechanical determination.
The penetration of Hurricane Miranda's eye wall lasted exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds, but Elena would remember every moment for the rest of her life. It was like being inside a giant washing machine filled with concrete blocks, an experience of violence so pure and relentless that survival became a matter of endurance rather than skill. And then, suddenly, they were through. The transition from the eye wall into Hurricane Miranda's eye was so abrupt it felt like stepping from a battlefield into a cathedral. The wind dropped from over 200 miles per hour to less than 20. The turbulence that had been trying to tear their aircraft apart disappeared entirely. Even the rain stopped, leaving them flying through an enormous cylinder of clear air surrounded by towering walls of cloud that rose 60,000 feet into the stratosphere. "My God," Marcus whispered, staring out at the hurricane's eye. "It's beautiful." I had to agree. The eye of Hurricane Miranda was a masterpiece of atmospheric dynamics, a perfect circle of calm nearly 30 miles across, surrounded by clouds so tall they disappeared into the darkness above. Sunlight filtered down from somewhere far overhead, illuminating the walls of the eye with an ethereal glow that made the entire structure look like a natural cathedral built from wind and water. But Elena's attention was focused on the ocean below, where she could see Pelican Point lighthouse rising from water that stretched unbroken to the horizon. The small coral island had completely disappeared, leaving only the lighthouse itself standing like a defiant finger pointed at the storm. "There," Elena said, banking toward the lighthouse. Tom was right. The structure is holding, but the island is gone. As they circled the lighthouse, Elena could see people crowded on the service platform near the top of the structure. They were waving frantically, 47 souls who had never expected to see an aircraft in the middle of a hurricane Category 5. The sight of their rescue arriving must have seemed like a miracle.
Tom, this is Elena. We are overhead and preparing for supply drop. How copy? Elena! Tom's voice came through clearly now that they were inside the eye's relative calm. Thank God, we can see you. People are crying up here. We all thought we were going to die. Elena felt tears starting in her own eyes. These were people who had volunteered to help with evacuations, researchers studying coral reefs, Coast Guard personnel dedicated to saving lives. They deserved better than to die in a lighthouse surrounded by an angry ocean. Tom, we're going to drop emergency supplies first, then return for evacuation flights. I need you to clear the service platform and get everyone ready for helicopter-style loading operations. Understood. Elena, thank you. Maria would be proud. Elena opened the aircraft's cargo door, carefully releasing packages of emergency supplies that deployed parachutes and drifted down toward the lighthouse. Medical supplies, food, fresh water, communications equipment, everything the survivors would need to maintain their position until evacuation could be completed. But as she watched the supplies descend, Elena noticed something that made her blood run cold. The eye wall surrounding them was beginning to contract. The massive walls of cloud were slowly moving inward, and the circle of clear air was getting smaller. "Marcus," Elena said, her voice tight with concern, "what's the eye diameter showing on radar?" Marcus checked his instruments, then looked up with wide eyes. 28 miles and shrinking. The cloud seeding might be working, but not the way we hoped. We're looking at eye wall contraction, not expansion. Elena realized with growing horror that their silver iodide injection had triggered an unintended consequence. Instead of expanding Hurricane Miranda's eye, they had accelerated the eye wall replacement cycle, causing the inner eye wall to contract more rapidly. The eye was getting smaller, which meant their window for evacuation was closing faster than anticipated. "How long before the eye wall reaches the lighthouse?" Elena asked. Marcus ran quick calculations on his tablet. "At current contraction rate, maybe 15 minutes, 20 at most." Elena felt the weight of 47 lives pressing down on her shoulders.
Even if everything went perfectly, she could evacuate perhaps 12 people per flight. 3 flights would rescue 36 people, leaving 11 souls still trapped when the eye wall closed around the lighthouse. And that assumed perfect conditions, no mechanical problems, no delays, no mistakes. "Elena," Tom's voice came over the radio, "we're seeing the clouds moving closer. How much time do we have?" Elena stared at the contracting eye wall, watching Hurricane Miranda prepare to reclaim its prey. The storm had allowed them inside, but now it was closing the door behind them. In less than 20 minutes, the lighthouse would be back inside the most violent weather on Earth. "Not enough," Elena whispered, then keyed her radio. "Tom, we're starting evacuation immediately. Get the first group ready for loading." Elena brought the Cessna into a hover-like slow flight pattern around the lighthouse, using every technique she had learned from years of storm penetration to maintain position in the light but unpredictable winds of the hurricane's eye. The service platform jutted out from the lighthouse about 80 feet above the churning water, barely large enough for the loading operation she was planning. "Marcus, I need you to coordinate the loading," Elena said, her voice steady despite the desperate mathematics running through her mind. 12 people maximum per flight. Prioritize the injured and anyone who can't climb efficiently. Through the aircraft's side window, Elena could see the people gathered on the lighthouse platform. They were a mixture of Coast Guard personnel in uniform, researchers in civilian clothes, and what appeared to be several elderly individuals who probably had been visiting the lighthouse when the evacuation order came too late. All of them were looking up at the Cessna with expressions of hope and desperate relief.
"Elena, this is Tom. Dr. Patricia Wang has a broken leg from when the storm surge hit. She needs to go first, along with 2 other injured. Can you take them?" Elena maneuvered the aircraft closer to the platform, fighting to maintain position as downdrafts from the eye wall created unpredictable air currents. The space available for loading was impossibly small, barely 10 feet of platform that wasn't cluttered with lighthouse equipment and emergency supplies. "Tom, we can't land. I'm going to have to hover while people jump into the cargo door. It's going to be dangerous." Elena had seen similar operations during Coast Guard training, but never in conditions like these. The aircraft would need to maintain a stable hover position while people literally leapt from the lighthouse platform into the Cessna's cargo bay. One mistake, one moment of hesitation or miscalculation, and someone would fall into the churning water below.
"Dr. Vasquez, this is Chief Petty Officer Sarah Martinez. We've got this organized. Coast Guard personnel will assist with loading operations. We know the risks." Elena felt a surge of gratitude for the professionalism of the people she was trying to save. Even trapped in the middle of a hurricane, facing almost certain death, they were organizing themselves for an efficient rescue operation. These were people who had dedicated their lives to saving others. They understood that successful rescue required discipline and cooperation even under extreme stress. Elena brought the Cessna to within 8 feet of the lighthouse platform, using differential power and careful control inputs to maintain position. The aircraft's engines were running at high power to counteract the complex air currents around the lighthouse structure, and she could feel the strain on both power plants. "First group ready," Martinez called out. "We've got Dr. Wang and 2 injured civilians. They're scared but ready to jump." Elena watched in her mirrors as the cargo door opened. Marcus had positioned himself to help coordinate the loading, and she could see him gesturing to the people on the platform. The first person to jump was a middle-aged woman with a makeshift splint on her leg, Dr. Patricia Wang, the researcher whose coral reef work might help save marine ecosystems worldwide. Dr. Wang's jump into the aircraft was an act of pure courage. Despite her injury, she launched herself from the lighthouse platform with the determination of someone who understood that hesitation meant death. Marcus caught her as she landed in the cargo bay, immediately helping her secure herself for the flight ahead. 2 more injured civilians followed, both elderly individuals who had been visiting the lighthouse when the storm struck. Elena watched in her mirrors as they made the terrifying leap from platform to aircraft, each jump requiring them to overcome every instinct for self-preservation and trust their lives to a meteorologist they had never met. "First group loaded," Marcus reported. "Elena, I'm seeing some stress indicators on the port engine. Oil temperature is climbing." Elena checked her engine instruments, seeing the warning signs Marcus had identified. The port engine was running hot, probably due to the high power settings required for hover operations in the unstable air around the lighthouse structure, and she could feel the strain on both power plants. "Tom, we need to get airborne now. Port engine is showing distress. We'll be back for the second group in 30 minutes. Elena carefully backed away from the lighthouse, transitioning from hover to forward flight as smoothly as possible to avoid stressing the damaged engine further. As they climbed away from Pelican Point, she could see the people still gathered on the platform, watching their rescue aircraft disappear into the hurricane's eye with expressions of hope and terror. The flight back to Marathon Airport was a race against time and mechanical failure. Elena nursed the damaged engine, keeping power settings as low as possible while still maintaining sufficient airspeed to penetrate the eye wall on the return trip. Behind her, she could hear Dr. Wang talking quietly with the other survivors, sharing medical knowledge and offering comfort despite her own injuries.
"Elena," Marcus said, studying the weather radar. "The eye is continuing to contract. Diameter is down to 24 miles and still shrinking. At this rate, we'll have maybe 2 more evacuation windows before the eye wall closes around the lighthouse." Elena felt the weight of impossible mathematics pressing down on her. 44 people remained on Pelican Point. Even if she could complete 2 more flights without mechanical failure, she could rescue perhaps 24 additional survivors. That would leave 20 people trapped in the lighthouse when Hurricane Miranda's eye wall closed around them for the final time. The penetration of the eye wall on the return trip was even more violent than before, partly because of the contracting eye and partly because of the damaged engine that was no longer developing full power. Elena fought to maintain control as wind shear tried to tear the aircraft apart, while behind her the 3 survivors endured forces that tested the limits of human endurance. "Engine fire warning!" Marcus shouted, pointing at the red light that illuminated on the engine panel. Elena's hands moved automatically through the emergency procedures she had practiced hundreds of times, but never performed in actual flight. She shut down the port engine, activated the fire suppression system, and transitioned to single-engine flight just as they broke through the eye wall into the relatively calm air above the Florida Keys. "Marathon Tower, this is 842 weather declaring emergency. We have an engine fire and 3 injured survivors aboard requesting immediate landing clearance." 842 weather, you are cleared for emergency landing. Fire equipment is standing by. Dr. Chen is en route for medical support. Elena landed the Cessna on one engine, using every technique she had learned from years of emergency training. The aircraft touched down smoothly despite the damaged power plant, and she could see emergency vehicles racing toward them across the rain-swept tarmac. Dr. Patricia Wang was the first to be helped from the aircraft, her face showing the strain of the traumatic evacuation, but also a fierce determination to survive. As she was loaded into the waiting ambulance, she grabbed Elena's arm. "Thank you," Dr. Wang said simply, "but you have to go back. Sarah Martinez has 3 children. Tom Bradley has been like a father to half the Coast Guard in the Keys. They're good people." Elena nodded, already running through the calculations for the return flight. The port engine was destroyed, but the Cessna 402 was designed for single-engine operations. She could still complete evacuation flights, though with reduced payload and performance margins that made an already dangerous mission even more suicidal. "Joe," Elena called to the airport manager, who was supervising the engine inspection, "how long to get this aircraft ready for another flight?" Joe's expression was grim as he examined the fire damage. "Elena, you can't fly this plane again.
The port engine is destroyed, the fire suppression system is depleted, and I'm seeing stress fractures in the wing root from the turbulence you've been through. This aircraft is done." Elena felt desperation rising in her throat. 44 people were still trapped on Pelican Point, and her only means of reaching them was broken beyond repair. She looked around the airport, seeing only empty hangars and aircraft that had been evacuated inland before the storm. "Wait," Marcus said, pointing toward the far end of the tarmac. "What about that helicopter?" Elena followed his gaze, seeing a Coast Guard HH-60 Jayhawk helicopter sitting near the airport's Coast Guard facility. The aircraft looked intact, though she could see damage to its hangar from hurricane-force winds. "That's Lieutenant Morrison's bird," Joe said, "but it was grounded with mechanical problems yesterday."
Elena was already running toward the helicopter, her mind racing through possibilities. She had helicopter training from her early years with the Weather Service, though she was far from current on rotorcraft operations. But a helicopter might be able to complete the evacuation more efficiently than the fixed-wing aircraft, carrying more people per flight and operating more easily around the lighthouse structure. Lieutenant Commander Morrison emerged from a nearby building as Elena approached the helicopter. His face showed the strain of watching a rescue operation he couldn't participate in due to official restrictions. "Dr. Vasquez," Morrison said, "I heard about your engine failure. Is everyone all right?" "3 survivors safe, but I need to get back to Pelican Point. Is this helicopter operational?" Morrison's expression grew conflicted. "The aircraft is mechanically sound, but I can't authorize civilian use of military equipment. Regulations—" "Jake," Elena interrupted, using his first name deliberately. 44 people are going to die in the next hour unless someone reaches them. The eye is contracting faster than predicted. This might be their only chance." Morrison stared at her for a long moment, then at the hurricane raging beyond the airport perimeter. Elena could see him weighing regulations against the reality of people trapped in a lighthouse, official protocols against the oath he had taken to save lives. "I can't authorize civilian use of this aircraft," Morrison said finally. "But if a qualified pilot were to borrow it during an emergency situation, I might not notice until after the crisis was resolved." Elena felt a surge of gratitude toward this young officer who was willing to risk his career for people he had never met. "Are you qualified to operate the aircraft?" "I'm the best Jayhawk pilot in the Coast Guard," Morrison replied with grim humor. "But I'm officially grounded by direct orders from Admiral Richardson." Elena understood the implications. Morrison couldn't officially participate in the rescue, but he could provide unofficial assistance that might mean the difference between success and failure. It was the kind of gray area that military personnel navigated carefully, balancing regulations against the fundamental mission of saving lives. "Jake," Elena said quietly, "I need someone to show me the aircraft's systems, unofficially." Morrison nodded, then began walking toward the helicopter. "Dr. Vasquez, I'm going to inspect this aircraft for storm damage. If you happen to observe the inspection and learn about the helicopter's operation in the process, that's not my responsibility." For the next 15 minutes, Elena received the most intensive helicopter training of her life. Morrison walked her through every system, every emergency procedure, every technique that might keep her alive during operations in the hurricane's eye. It was a compressed course in rotorcraft operations that normally required weeks of training. "The key is power management," Morrison explained, showing her the engine controls. "The Jayhawk has 2 turbine engines, but you'll be operating at the edge of their capabilities. Don't over-torque the rotors and watch your fuel consumption carefully. You'll have maybe 40 minutes of flight time before you need to return for fuel." Elena absorbed the information as quickly as possible, knowing that the people on Pelican Point were running out of time while she learned to fly an unfamiliar aircraft. The mathematics were still challenging. Even with the helicopter's greater capacity, she would need at least 3 flights to evacuate everyone. "Elena," Marcus called from across the tarmac, "weather update.
The eye diameter is down to 18 miles and contracting at an increasing rate. I'm estimating maybe 40 minutes before the lighthouse is back inside the eye wall.
Jake, Elena said to Morrison, I'm about to steal a Coast Guard helicopter. If you want to stop me, now is the time. Morrison looked at her steadily, then walked away from the aircraft. I'm going to check on the other equipment. I'll be back in an hour to inspect the helicopter for storm damage. Elena climbed into the pilot's seat of the HH-60 Jayhawk, her hands moving through the startup sequence Morrison had just taught her. The helicopter's turbine engines spooled up with a whine that cut through the hurricane winds, and she felt the aircraft come alive beneath her hands. Marcus, Elena called over the intercom, are you ready for this? Marcus, now buckled into the co-pilot's seat, managed a weak smile. Elena, I've followed you through one impossible rescue already. Let's go save some more lives. As the Coast Guard helicopter lifted off from Marathon Airport, Elena could see the wall of Hurricane Miranda stretching across the horizon like a mountain range made of clouds and wind. Somewhere inside that maelstrom, 44 people were waiting for a rescue that defied every regulation, every protocol, every rational calculation of risk and survival. But as they climbed toward the hurricane's eye, Elena thought about her sister Maria, about Chief Petty Officer Sarah Martinez's 3 children, about Dr. Patricia Wang's groundbreaking research that might help save coral reefs worldwide. Some mathematics went beyond numbers, involving calculations of human worth and courage that couldn't be quantified in any computer model. Pelican Point, this is Elena, she called over the radio as they approached the eye wall. We're coming back. Hold on.
Elena could see what Tom meant. The service platform, which had been about 80 feet above mean sea level, was now being struck by waves that rose nearly to its level. Each surge sent spray cascading over the gathered survivors, and the entire lighthouse structure was vibrating under the constant assault of wind and water. Tom, we can take 15 people per flight, Elena called out, circling to assess the loading situation. Get the next group ready. Prioritize anyone who's injured or having difficulty maintaining position. Elena had never attempted a rescue hoist operation, but Morrison had explained the basics during their brief training session. The Jayhawk was equipped with a rescue hoist capable of lifting people directly from the lighthouse platform, eliminating the dangerous jumping procedure they had used with the Cessna. Marcus, I need you to operate the hoist controls, Elena said, transitioning to a hover over the lighthouse. Lower the basket and help coordinate loading from above. Marcus moved to the hoist operator position, his face showing the strain of learning complex rescue procedures while suspended inside the eye of a Category 5 hurricane. But his hands were steady as he lowered the rescue basket toward the platform where Chief Petty Officer Martinez was organizing the next group for evacuation. The first person into the basket was an elderly man who appeared to be struggling with the altitude and stress of their situation. Elena watched in her mirrors as Martinez and another Coast Guard petty officer helped him secure himself, then signaled for liftoff. The hoist motor whined as it pulled the basket up toward the helicopter, bringing the first survivor of the second evacuation flight to safety. One aboard, Marcus reported, lowering for the next pickup. The operation proceeded with military efficiency despite conditions that challenged every parameter of normal rescue work. Each hoist cycle took approximately 2 minutes, and Elena could feel the helicopter's fuel consumption climbing as she maintained hover position in the unstable air around the lighthouse. Worse, she could see the eye wall continuing to contract, the walls of clouds moving closer with each passing minute. Tom, we need to speed up the evacuation. The eye wall is becoming unstable. By the time they had loaded 12 people into the helicopter, Elena could see multiple tornadoes forming in the eye wall around them. These mesovortices were relatively small, perhaps 200 yards across, but they were moving at incredible speeds and appeared to be gradually working their way inward toward the lighthouse. Elena, Marcus said, his voice tight with fear, we need to get out of here now. Those tornadoes are getting closer. Elena made the agonizing decision to depart with 12 survivors instead of waiting for the full 15 she had hoped to carry. As they climbed away from the lighthouse, she could see one of the mesovortices pass within a few hundred yards of Pelican Point, its funnel visible as a dark column connecting the eye wall to the churning ocean below.
The flight back to Marathon Airport was complicated by the increasing instability of Hurricane Miranda's structure. The eye-wall penetration was more violent than before, with embedded tornadoes creating localized areas of extreme turbulence that threatened to tear the helicopter apart. Elena fought to maintain control while 12 rescued survivors endured forces that tested the limits of human endurance. "Fuel warning," Marcus shouted as they broke through the eye wall into the relative safety above the Florida Keys. Elena checked her fuel gauges, seeing that the intensive hover operations and high-power penetrations had consumed fuel faster than anticipated.
Marathon Tower, this is the Coast Guard helicopter with 12 survivors aboard. We're showing low fuel and need immediate landing clearance. Coast Guard helicopter, you are cleared for immediate landing. Medical personnel are standing by. Elena landed the Jayhawk with fuel reserves that would have been considered dangerously low under normal circumstances. As the survivors were helped from the aircraft, including Chief Petty Officer Sarah Martinez, whose first words were about her children waiting at home, Elena calculated the remaining rescue requirements. 32 people still on the lighthouse, she told Morrison, who had appeared as soon as the helicopter landed. 2 more flights, minimum. Morrison checked his watch and studied the approaching storm. "Elena, I've been monitoring the weather data. The eye diameter is down to 8 miles and still contracting. You might have time for 1 more flight, possibly 2, if everything goes perfectly." Elena felt the familiar weight of impossible mathematics. 32 people remained, but she could only rescue perhaps 15 per flight. Under perfect conditions, she would be forced to leave people behind when the hurricane's eye finally closed around the lighthouse for the last time. "Jake," Elena said quietly, "I need to ask you something. If this were an official Coast Guard operation, what would the protocol be for a situation where you can't save everyone?" Morrison's face showed the strain of a question every rescue pilot dreaded. "We save as many as we can, and we live with the mathematics." Elena nodded, understanding that she was about to face the same impossible choice that haunted rescue professionals worldwide. She would have to look into the faces of people she couldn't save, knowing that time and fuel and weather were determining who lived and who died based on factors beyond anyone's control. "Elena," Marcus said, approaching with a tablet showing the latest weather data, "I've been running projections on the eye wall contraction rate. Based on current observations, we have approximately 35 minutes before the lighthouse is back inside the eye wall. That's enough time for 2 flights if we can complete turnarounds in 15 minutes each." Elena studied the numbers, seeing the thin margin for success. 2 more flights could rescue 30 people, leaving 2 souls still trapped when the storm closed around them. It was better mathematics than she had dared hope for, but it still meant facing the reality of leaving people behind. "Let's do it," Elena said, moving toward the refueled helicopter. 30 people is better than none. The third evacuation flight took place with Hurricane Miranda's eye contracted to barely 6 miles in diameter. The lighthouse now sat in what felt like a circular stadium, surrounded by towering walls of cloud that rose so high they disappeared into darkness above. Elena could see multiple mesovortices spinning around the eye wall like deadly satellites, and the ocean below was so turbulent it looked like boiling water. "Tom, this is Elena on final approach," she called out as she brought the helicopter into hover position. "How many people do we have left?" 32 souls, Tom replied, his voice showing the strain of hours spent coordinating survival operations under impossible conditions. "Elena, I need to tell you something. We've been drawing lots." Elena felt her heart sink. Drawing lots, the ancient maritime tradition used when not everyone could be saved. The survivors had been forced to face the mathematical reality she had been dreading, organizing themselves to determine who would have the best chance at rescue. "Tom, we're going to get everyone," Elena said firmly. "I don't accept any other outcome." But even as she spoke the words, Elena could see the eye wall continuing to contract. The mesovortices were growing larger and more numerous, and she estimated they had perhaps 20 minutes before the lighthouse was back inside conditions that no aircraft could survive.
The third evacuation proceeded with desperate efficiency. Elena managed to load 16 people into the helicopter, pushing the aircraft beyond its normal payload limits, but staying within the envelope that might allow them to reach Marathon Airport safely. Among those rescued was Dr. Samuel Rodriguez, the lead researcher whose coral restoration work was pioneering new approaches to marine conservation. "Elena," Dr. Rodriguez said as he was helped into the helicopter, "Tom Bradley insisted on staying with the lighthouse. He says someone needs to maintain the structure, keep the light operational for mariners who might need it."
Elena felt a chill of understanding. Tom Bradley, the lighthouse keeper who had known her sister Maria, was planning to go down with his station like the ship captains of old. It was both nobility and tragedy, the kind of gesture that defined the difference between duty and mere employment. "And the others?" Elena asked. 15 volunteers, mostly Coast Guard personnel, Dr. Rodriguez replied. "They're planning to ride out the storm in the lamp room. They think the structure will hold." Elena wanted to argue, to insist that she could somehow rescue everyone, but as she lifted off from the lighthouse for what might be the final time, she could see that Hurricane Miranda's eye had contracted to perhaps 4 miles in diameter. The walls were so close now that individual features were visible: massive, rotating updrafts, cascading waterfalls of precipitation, electrical discharges that lit the clouds from within like a cosmic light show. The flight back to Marathon Airport was a desperate race against fuel exhaustion and structural failure. The helicopter's engines were running beyond their normal parameters, and Elena could feel vibrations in the airframe that suggested they were approaching the limits of what the aircraft could endure. The 16 survivors in the cabin endured G-forces and turbulence that would have been considered extreme torture under any other circumstances. "Fuel critical," Marcus shouted as they dropped through the eye wall for what Elena hoped would not be the final time. "We're running on fumes." Elena could see Marathon Airport ahead, its emergency lights cutting through the storm like a beacon of hope. But she could also see her fuel gauges showing levels that were dangerously close to empty. They might have enough fuel to reach the airport, but there would be nothing left for another flight. The landing was harder than Elena had intended, the helicopter settling onto the tarmac with a mechanical groan that spoke of systems pushed beyond their design limits. As the engine spooled down and the survivors were helped from the aircraft, Elena found herself staring at fuel gauges that showed empty tanks. "Elena," Morrison said as he approached the helicopter, "that was incredible flying. 31 people rescued from conditions that grounded every other aircraft in the region." Elena felt no sense of triumph. 16 people remained on Pelican Point, including Tom Bradley, the lighthouse keeper who had known her sister. They had chosen to stay behind, but their choice was based on the reality that there simply wasn't enough time, fuel, or aircraft capacity to save everyone. "Jake," Elena said quietly, "what are their chances?" Morrison's expression was grim. "The lighthouse is built to withstand Category 4 conditions. Miranda is Category 5 and intensifying. The structure might hold, but the storm surge—" He shrugged, unable to complete the devastating calculation. Elena walked away from the helicopter, feeling the weight of incomplete rescue pressing down on her shoulders. She had saved 31 lives, but 16 people were still facing almost certain death in a lighthouse that might not survive the strongest hurricane ever recorded. "Dr. Vasquez?" a voice called out through the storm. Elena turned to see Admiral Richardson approaching, his uniform soaked despite the heavy rain gear. "I heard about your rescue operations." Elena braced herself for official censure for the regulations and protocols she had violated during the unauthorized rescue flights. Instead, Admiral Richardson surprised her. 31 lives, the Admiral said simply. "That's 31 families who will see their loved ones again because of what you did today. The Coast Guard doesn't officially recognize unauthorized rescue operations, but I want you to know that every pilot in my command considers you a hero."
Elena felt tears mixing with the rain on her face. "Admiral, there are still 16 people on that lighthouse." "I know. And, if conditions improve even slightly, we'll attempt another rescue. But Elena, what you accomplished today was impossible. You flew into the strongest hurricane ever recorded and brought back 31 people who would have died without your intervention." As if summoned by their conversation, Tom Bradley's voice crackled over the emergency radio. "Elena, can you hear me?" Elena grabbed the radio, her heart racing. "Tom, this is Elena. What's your status?" "We're secure in the lamp room. The lighthouse is holding better than expected. Elena, I want you to know, Maria would have been proud of what you did today. 31 souls saved? That's a good day's work by any measure."
Elena closed her eyes, feeling the presence of her sister in the storm around them. Maria had died trying to save 2 people in Hurricane Andrew. Elena had saved 31 in Hurricane Miranda. Perhaps that was the mathematics that mattered, not the precise calculus of rescue operations, but the broader equation of courage and determination that defined what it meant to be human in the face of natural forces beyond comprehension. "Elena," Elena said into the radio, "we're not giving up if there's any chance." "Elena," Tom interrupted gently, "we've made our peace with this. The lighthouse has stood for over a century. If it's time for her to go, at least she won't go alone." Hurricane Miranda's eye passed completely over Pelican Point at 8:47 a.m., bringing Tom Bradley and 15 volunteers back inside the storm's deadliest quadrant. For the next 6 hours, Elena and hundreds of other rescue personnel monitored emergency frequencies, hoping for some word from the lighthouse that had become a symbol of human defiance against nature's fury. The radio remained silent. Hurricane Miranda made landfall on the Florida Keys at 2:15 p.m. as a Category 5 storm with sustained winds of 195 miles per hour. The storm surge reached heights of 24 feet, completely submerging most of the lower Keys and causing damage that exceeded Hurricane Andrew by almost any measure. The lighthouse at Pelican Point, built in 1892 and maintained by Tom Bradley for over 40 years, was never seen again. But 31 people lived because a meteorologist named Elena Vasquez decided that some mathematics went beyond computer models and probability calculations. 31 families were reunited because 2 men, a weather forecaster and a Coast Guard pilot, chose to interpret regulations in favor of human life rather than bureaucratic safety. Chief Petty Officer Sarah Martinez returned to her 3 children who had been evacuated inland and spent the hurricane in a Red Cross shelter, wondering if their mother would survive. Dr. Patricia Wang's research on coral reef resilience eventually led to breakthrough techniques for marine ecosystem restoration. Dr. Samuel Rodriguez published findings that helped establish new protocols for marine research station evacuations. And Elena Vasquez received a letter 3 weeks after Hurricane Miranda, delivered through official Coast Guard channels, but bearing no return address. Inside was Tom Bradley's lighthouse keeper's log, found floating in a waterproof container near Key West. The final entry, written in Tom's careful handwriting, read simply, "The light held until the end. Maria's sister flies like the angels. 31 souls saved. The mathematics of mercy." 6 months after Hurricane Miranda, Elena stood on the rebuilt dock at Key West, watching a new lighthouse being constructed where Pelican Point had once risen from the sea. The coral island itself was gone, scoured away by storm surge and 20-foot waves, but the Coast Guard had decided to honor Tom Bradley's sacrifice by building a modern replacement structure equipped with the latest navigation and rescue technology. The memorial plaque at the base of the new lighthouse bore 16 names, including Tom Bradley's, along with a simple inscription, "They chose to hold the light." Elena had been invited to the dedication ceremony as the guest of honor, though she still struggled with being called a hero for a mission that ultimately failed to save everyone. "Elena," Chief Petty Officer Sarah Martinez approached, her 3 children in tow.
Emma, the 7-year-old who collected seashells, ran up to Elena with a handful of coral fragments she had found on the beach. "Dr. Elena," Emma said excitedly, "look what I found. Mommy says you're the one who saved her in the big storm." Elena knelt down to examine Emma's collection, seeing fragments of coral that probably had been torn from the reef system around Pelican Point during Hurricane Miranda. The storm had destroyed the lighthouse, but it had also scattered pieces of the reef system across hundreds of miles of ocean floor, potentially seeding new coral colonies in areas where they had never existed before.
"Your mommy is very brave," Elena told Emma. "She helped save a lot of people that day." Sarah Martinez smiled, but Elena could see the shadow that still haunted her eyes. The Coast Guard officer had lost 15 colleagues in the lighthouse, including her mentor and several close friends. The mathematics of survival created its own form of survivor's guilt. Why had she been chosen for the 3rd evacuation flight instead of the 2nd or 4th? "Elena," Sarah said quietly, "I wanted you to know that the Coast Guard is implementing new hurricane evacuation protocols based on what happened at Pelican Point. We're establishing forward staging areas, pre-positioned rescue equipment, communication redundancies. What you did that day is going to save lives for decades to come." Elena nodded, understanding that this was how progress happened in emergency response. Through tragedy that revealed gaps in preparation, through heroes who pushed beyond established protocols, through lessons written in courage and loss. Tom Bradley's sacrifice and her own desperate rescue flights were becoming case studies in hurricane response, analyzed and incorporated into training programs that would prepare future rescuers for storms that hadn't yet been born. "Dr. Vasquez?" A young woman approached, wearing the khaki uniform of a Coast Guard Academy cadet. "I'm Cadet Sofia Martinez. Sarah is my aunt. I wanted to thank you for saving my family." Elena studied the young woman's face, seeing the family resemblance to Sarah and recognizing the determined expression that seemed to run in the Martinez family. "What's your specialty at the academy?" "Aviation rescue," Sofia replied with a grin. "I want to be a helicopter pilot. My aunt told me about what you did during Miranda, how you learned to fly the Jayhawk in 15 minutes and completed evacuations that seasoned pilots thought were impossible. She said if a meteorologist could do it, maybe a cadet who actually trained for rescue operations could do even better." Elena felt a surge of pride mixed with concern. The rescue operations during Hurricane Miranda were being romanticized, turned into stories that might inspire young people to take unnecessary risks. But she could also see that Sofia Martinez had inherited the courage and dedication that defined her family. "Sofia," Elena said carefully, "what I did during Miranda was necessary, but also incredibly dangerous. The only reason it worked was because I understood the storm structure better than anyone else, and even then, we barely survived. Don't let my story make you think that rescue operations are about individual heroics. They're about training, preparation, teamwork, and knowing when the risks are justified." Sofia nodded seriously. "Aunt Sarah told me the same thing, but she also said that sometimes you have to make impossible choices, and the only way to live with them is to be absolutely certain you did everything you could." Elena thought about Tom Bradley's final radio transmission, about the 16 people who had chosen to stay with the lighthouse. 6 months later, she still wondered if there had been some other option, some calculation she had missed that might have saved everyone. The mathematics of rescue would always be incomplete, leaving variables that couldn't be solved through equations or weather models. "Elena," Marcus Chen's voice called out across the marina. Elena turned to see her colleague approaching with Dr. James Riley, both men wearing the casual clothes that marked them as off-duty meteorologists, rather than the officials who had supported her impossible mission 6 months earlier. "Marcus, Dr. Riley," Elena said warmly, "I wasn't sure you'd make it to the ceremony." "Wouldn't miss it. Besides, I have news. The National Weather Service is establishing a new rapid response team for extreme weather events. Guess who they want to head it up? Elena felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The bureaucratic wheels of government moved slowly, but Hurricane Miranda had apparently created enough momentum to justify new approaches to weather emergency response. What kind of rapid response? Storm penetration flights for rescue support, specially modified aircraft, trained meteorologist pilots, real-time weather analysis for search and rescue operations. Everything you improvised during Miranda, but with proper equipment and official support.
Hurricane was both gratifying and sobering. It meant that her unauthorized flights had been recognized as valuable innovations rather than dangerous violations of protocol. There's more, Riley continued. Congress is considering the Elena Vasquez Emergency Response Act. It would establish new protocols for civilian assistance during disasters, create legal protections for emergency responders who exceed their authorized scope during life-threatening situations. Elena felt overwhelmed by the implications. Her name would be attached to legislation that might influence emergency response for generations. It was an honor that carried the weight of Tom Bradley's sacrifice and the memory of 16 people who had died because the existing system couldn't save everyone. "I'll think about it," Elena said finally. "But right now, I want to focus on this." She gestured toward the lighthouse construction, where workers were installing the lamp assembly that would guide ships through the dangerous waters around the Florida Keys. The new light was LED-based, more powerful and reliable than the traditional beacon Tom Bradley had maintained for 40 years. But its purpose remained the same, to provide guidance for travelers caught in dangerous conditions, to offer hope when all other references failed. "Elena," Sarah Martinez said, rejoining their conversation, "there's someone here who wants to meet you." Elena turned to see an elderly woman approaching, her white hair pulled back in a style that seemed familiar, despite Elena's certainty that they had never met. The woman walked with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command, and Elena noticed the small pin on her jacket, the distinctive anchor and wings of Coast Guard aviation. "Dr. Vasquez," the woman said, extending her hand, "I'm Admiral Ruth Harrison, retired. I flew rescue missions for 32 years, including Hurricane Andrew in 1992. Elena felt her breath catch. Hurricane Andrew, the storm that had killed her sister Maria. "Admiral, it's an honor to meet you." "Dr. Vasquez, I wanted to tell you about a paramedic named Maria Vasquez who died during Andrew. She was trying to reach an elderly couple trapped in a mobile home when flying debris struck her ambulance. I was part of the rescue coordination that day." Elena's eyes filled with tears as she listened to Admiral Harrison describe her sister's final mission. The details she had never known, the professional assessment of Maria's actions, the recognition that her sister's death had not been meaningless, but part of a larger pattern of courage that defined emergency response. "Your sister saved 4 people that day before the accident," Admiral Harrison continued. "Her actions during Andrew became part of our training curriculum. Every Coast Guard rescue swimmer learns about paramedic Maria Vasquez and the importance of calculated risks in emergency situations." Elena felt a profound sense of completion, as if a circle that had been broken 31 years ago was finally being closed. Maria's sacrifice had influenced a generation of rescue personnel, just as Elena's desperate flights during Hurricane Miranda were shaping new approaches to storm emergency response. "Admiral," Elena said quietly, "thank you for telling me. Maria always wanted to make a difference." "She did," Admiral Harrison replied firmly, "and so have you. The techniques you developed during Miranda are being studied by rescue organizations worldwide. Your understanding of hurricane structure, combined with operational rescue experience, is creating new possibilities for storm response that we never thought possible."
As the sun set over the Florida Keys, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded Elena of satellite imagery from countless storms, the dedication ceremony for the new Pelican Point lighthouse began. Hundreds of people had gathered: Coast Guard personnel, Weather Service employees, survivors of Hurricane Miranda, families of those who had been lost.
Admiral Richardson took the podium, his dress uniform decorated with ribbons that spoke of decades spent saving lives in dangerous conditions. Today, we dedicate this lighthouse to 16 people who chose to hold their positions when retreat was possible, who maintained their duties when duty became sacrifice. But we also celebrate 31 people who lived because others chose to exceed the boundaries of what was considered possible. Elena listened as the Admiral recounted the events of Hurricane Miranda, the unauthorized rescue flights that had violated regulations but saved lives, the cooperation between civilian and military personnel that had demonstrated the best of human response to natural disaster. The story was already becoming legend, polished by retelling and shaped by the needs of institutions that wanted to extract lessons from tragedy. "Dr. Elena Vasquez," Admiral Richardson called out, "please join me at the podium." Elena walked forward through the crowd, feeling the weight of attention from hundreds of people who saw her as something between a hero and a cautionary tale. She had never wanted to be the center of such ceremonies, preferring the anonymous satisfaction of weather forecasts that protected communities and research that advanced scientific understanding. "Dr. Vasquez," Admiral Richardson said, "by the authority vested in me by the Commandant of the Coast Guard, I hereby present you with the Coast Guard Medal for Heroism, the highest decoration we can award to a civilian." Elena accepted the medal, feeling its weight as a physical representation of responsibility rather than achievement. The decoration was beautiful, a bronze star suspended from red, white, and blue ribbon, but its real meaning lay in the lives it represented and the obligations it created for the future. "Thank you," Elena said into the microphone, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "This medal belongs to everyone who participated in the rescue operations during Hurricane Miranda. Tom Bradley, who maintained his lighthouse until the end. Lieutenant Commander Morrison, who provided training and equipment that made the mission possible. Marcus Chen, who risked his life as my co-pilot. The Coast Guard personnel who organized evacuation operations under impossible conditions." Elena paused, looking out at the faces in the crowd. Survivors, rescuers, family members, officials who were already planning how to institutionalize the lessons learned from one desperate day in the eye of a hurricane. 6 months ago, I thought I understood hurricanes. I had studied them for 15 years, published papers on their structure and behavior, participated in research flights that collected valuable scientific data. But I learned something during Hurricane Miranda that can't be found in any textbook or computer model. Elena's voice grew stronger as she found the words to express what she had discovered inside the eye of the strongest storm ever recorded. "I learned that the mathematics of rescue go beyond wind speeds and pressure gradients. They include variables that can't be quantified. Courage, determination, the willingness to risk everything for people you've never met. Tom Bradley understood that mathematics when he chose to stay with his lighthouse. My sister Maria understood it when she drove into Hurricane Andrew to save strangers." Elena looked toward the new lighthouse, its beacon already operational and casting its beam across waters that had claimed 16 lives 6 months earlier. "This lighthouse stands as a memorial to people who held their positions when holding was impossible. But it also serves as a beacon for the future, a reminder that sometimes the most important calculations are the ones that go beyond pure mathematics." As applause echoed across the marina, Elena thought about the events that had brought her to this moment. A Category 5 hurricane that had challenged every assumption about storm intensity. 47 people trapped in the lighthouse surrounded by an angry ocean. A meteorologist who had learned to fly rescue helicopters in 15 minutes because no one else was available to save lives that deserved saving.
The new rapid response team would be more professional, better equipped, officially supported. Future rescues would benefit from the lessons learned during Hurricane Miranda, the protocols developed through necessity, the understanding that extreme weather required extreme measures.
But Elena knew that the real legacy of that desperate day lay not in new regulations or improved equipment, but in the demonstration that human courage could sometimes overcome impossible mathematics. 2 years after Hurricane Miranda, Elena received a package with no return address delivered to her office at the National Weather Service's new Extreme Weather Response Center. Inside was a piece of coral, carefully preserved and mounted on a wooden base that bore the inscription, "From Pelican Point Reef, scattered by Hurricane Miranda, found growing in new waters off Key Largo." Attached was a note written in Tom Bradley's careful handwriting. The lighthouse keeper's final gift. Some things survive the storm and grow in new places. The mathematics of hope. Elena placed the coral on her desk, where it joined her sister's paramedic badge and a photograph of the Coast Guard HH-60 Jayhawk helicopter that had carried 31 people to safety through the eye of the strongest hurricane ever recorded. They were talismans that reminded her daily that the most important calculations were often the ones that couldn't be reduced to numbers. The mathematics of mercy, courage, and the human determination to hold the light even when the darkness seemed certain to prevail. 5 years after Hurricane Miranda, the National Weather Service's Extreme Weather Response Team had conducted 17 successful rescue operations in conditions that would have grounded conventional aircraft. They had saved 412 lives using techniques pioneered during Elena's desperate flights into the eye of a Category 5 hurricane. The Elena Vasquez Emergency Response Act had been signed into law, creating legal protections for emergency responders who exceeded their authority during life-threatening situations. But perhaps the most important legacy was smaller and more personal. Sofia Martinez graduated from the Coast Guard Academy and was assigned to Air Station Miami, where she flew rescue missions in hurricanes using protocols developed from the lessons learned at Pelican Point. Dr. Patricia Wang's coral research led to breakthrough techniques for marine restoration that helped marine ecosystems recover from increasingly powerful storms. Emma Martinez, now 12 years old, had started a blog about marine conservation that reached thousands of young people interested in protecting ocean environments. And Elena continued to track hurricanes, to study their structure and behavior, to provide forecasts that gave communities the warning time they needed to prepare for nature's fury. But she also understood that her work was about more than meteorology. It was about the mathematics of hope, the calculations that proved human courage could sometimes overcome impossible odds, that holding the light was always worthwhile, even when the darkness seemed certain to prevail. On quiet nights when the radar screens showed clear weather across the Atlantic basin, Elena would look at the coral fragment on her desk and remember Tom Bradley's words, "Some things survive the storm and grow in new places." Hurricane Miranda had scattered pieces of Pelican Point Reef across hundreds of miles of ocean floor, creating new coral colonies that might never have existed otherwise. Destruction and creation, loss and growth, tragedy and hope, all part of the same vast equation that governed both weather systems and human hearts. The lighthouse at Pelican Point had been rebuilt, but the real memorial to Tom Bradley and his 15 companions was larger and more enduring. It existed in every rescue flight that pushed beyond established limits, every decision to risk everything for strangers, every moment when someone chose to hold the light regardless of the mathematics of survival. It lived in the understanding that some calculations went beyond numbers, involving variables that could only be measured in courage, determination, and the fundamental human refusal to abandon hope even when hope seemed mathematically impossible.
Elena Vasquez had flown into the eye of Hurricane Miranda as a meteorologist seeking to understand storms. She had emerged as something more, a guardian of the mathematics of mercy, a keeper of the light that guided others through the darkness, a living reminder that the most important calculations were often the ones that couldn't be solved through equations,
but only through the fierce determination to save lives that deserved saving. And on her desk, the coral fragment from Pelican Point continued to grow, adding new structure day by day, building something beautiful and enduring from the scattered remains of destruction. A perfect metaphor for the way courage could transform tragedy into hope, mathematics into miracle, the memory of 16 lost souls into the salvation of hundreds more. Subscribe to She Stood First, where silence is never forgotten.